They grabbed her by the arm before she could speak. "This area is for first class only," the agent snapped, loud enough for half the terminal to hear. She didn't argue. She just handed over her boarding pass. 3A clear, verified, ignored. "We'll need to reconfirm," he said, already waving security over. Within moments, a black woman in silence was being escorted away like a criminal, while the white man behind her walked through without so much as a glance. But what no one at that gate realized, not the staff, not the passengers watching, not even the smug supervisor giving the order, was that the woman they just tried to humiliate wasn't just any traveler. Her name was Leah Grant. She owned more of their future than their CEO ever would. And now their fall was already in motion. Think this is just another discrimination story? Watch closely. This isn't about a boarding pass, it's about who holds the real power. What would you do in her place? Comment below and tell us where you're tuning in from. And if you believe some lines should never be crossed, hit that subscribe because you won't believe how this ends. Leah Grant stepped through the doors of the business class cabin, her heels clicking softly on the soft carpet. Her navy suit, refined and sharp, fit as if it had been tailored for a special occasion. Her every step seemed to blend into the space, making the business class cabin a harmonious picture of luxury and elegance. But as Leah entered, a figure stopped at the end of the aisle, blocking her way. Chloe Barnes, the flight attendant with the neat uniform, blocked in front of Leah without hesitation. "Ma'am, economy is the other way." Her voice was cold, not hiding her annoyance. Just one sentence, but enough to make the surrounding gazes stop. The faces began to curiously look in her direction. Leah said nothing. She gently pulled the e-ticket from her bag and held it out to Chloe, her hands resting firmly on it, as if to confirm that she was not lost. "Seat 3A, she said, her voice even, neither rushed nor flustered. Each word carried the calm and authority that only comes when one knows one's worth. Chloe frowned, not rushing to accept the ticket. Her sharp gaze scanned Leah from head to toe, as if searching for some flaw, some reason to deny her presence in the compartment. Chloe's blue eyes held no suspicion of inappropriateness, only silent, contemptuous rejection. No apology, no explanation. A heavy feeling filled the air. There was a long, cold silence, as if everything had quieted down, except for the steady breathing of the passengers around them, as if they were witnessing something unjust and unreasonable happening right before their eyes. Leah stood there, steadfast, not resisting, not breaking under Chloe's gaze. But in that moment of silence, this woman of color knew that the judgment she was being subjected to was not just because of the ticket, but because of her presence, simply because she was her. The air seemed to freeze. Leah, with unshakable confidence, stood like a rock in the midst of the whirlpool of judgment. Chloe, like a cold storm, was judging quickly and decisively. And in this space, the question quietly emerged. Who is really being wronged? Chloe muttered something, barely audible, but enough for the supervisor, Carter Hill, who was standing nearby, to turn around. Carter, dressed in a crisp gray suit, walked quickly. Every step he took was a declaration of the power he assumed. His polished leather shoes clicked steadily against the floor, creating a knocking sound of oppression. He looked at Leah coldly, his gaze full of power, as if he had already determined the outcome of every situation before it happened. Without a greeting, without a word, Carter simply gestured for the flight attendant to continue her actions. "Check her boarding pass," Carter ordered firmly, as if he were talking about something unimportant. Just a procedure that everyone needed to follow. Leah said nothing. She didn't get angry, she didn't beg for mercy, she didn't show any sign of trembling. Only her eyes, calm, emotionless eyes that seemed to see through everything. She stared straight at Carter, unwavering. He didn't bother to look at the ticket again. Not at all. Instead, he gestured for the guards standing nearby to close in, their presence almost invisible in the air, but clearly visible to those around them. Their gazes were sharp, as if Leah were a potential threat, and Carter needed only a gentle wave of his hand to make her the object of surveillance. The passengers around them began to turn. Some, phones in hand, began to record videos, their eyes curious, judgmental behind each glance. Others, their keen eyes expressing sympathy, but no one spoke. The air was so heavy it was almost palpable, like a layer of fog was settling over the space. Leah remained silent. There was no need to say anything else. Her silence was not out of fear, but because she knew that sometimes power did not need to be demonstrated by words or exaggerated actions. Her eyes were enough to express what words could not. She was just a strong woman, standing in a world where power was sometimes determined by decisions that were never made in public, only worked quietly beneath the surface. Everything happened in silence, a thick, cold silence that filled the air. Leah, still as calm as before, was escorted out of the business-class cabin under the watchful eyes of the guards. Every step she took was like a silent sentence. Every glance from the passengers around her was like a sharp knife cutting into her heart. All she could feel was the coldness of that gaze, as if no one understood the story beneath the outer shell. She did not complain, did not react. Only her strong silence echoed in the quiet space. No one knew what she had endured, things that only those who had experienced them could feel most clearly. Leah walked through the rows of seats where every gaze seemed to question, wanted to speak, but was repelled by the oppressive silence. A white man stepped up behind Leah, boarding pass in hand, and no one looked at him suspiciously. He simply walked through, no questions asked, no need to prove anything. The difference was too obvious to ignore. Chloe glanced at him, her eyes blank, then looked away as if nothing was amiss. She continued her work as if it had nothing to do with her, even though the judgment had been made right before her eyes. A little girl sat nearby, her innocent eyes watching Leah being led away. She turned to her mother, asking softly, but the question felt like a slap in the mother's heart. "Mommy, why was she taken away?" The question hung in the air, but the mother only shook her head, saying nothing. She had no explanation that could cover up the painful truth. This silent answer was all she could offer. But Leah? She was used to this silence, to rooms where decisions were made without anyone having the courage to confront her directly. She had been in those spaces before, where fairness was a distant concept. She didn't need sympathy, didn't need justification. She knew that these decisions were predetermined, even if no one dared to admit it. She had lived in this world for so long that, sometimes, silence was the only way to survive. And in that silence, Leah kept walking, never looking back, only her unwavering gaze never wavering. She didn't rush, didn't scold, didn't try to regain the rights that had been taken away. Leah just calmly took the phone from her bag, a gentle but calculated action. She unlocked the screen, the light from the phone shining on her face that didn't reveal any emotion. There was no panic, no anger, just a gentle but powerful decision. She pressed call, then softly spoke. "Activate Clause B, Flight 719, Terminal C, now." The entire sentence was less than 3 seconds long, but it contained all the confidence of someone who understood her power. She did not need to explain further, did not need to raise her voice. Those words had been transmitted, and what happened next would say it all. Carter stood beside him, smirking, his eyes full of contempt. He thought Leah was simply calling a lawyer, trying to justify the mistake they were making. The smile seemed to say that it was all a game, that Leah would get nowhere, that everything would end in the silence he had grown accustomed to. Little did he know that in 3 minutes, everything would change completely. Less than 3 minutes later, the door of the hotel waiting room opened. A middle-aged woman who looked like a high-ranking executive, dressed formally but hurriedly, walked in. Her demeanor was unlike that of an ordinary employee. Her eyes were sharp, and as soon as she entered, all eyes were on her. Leah stood still calm, not saying a word. The woman stood in front of Leah, then spoke softly. "Miss Grant, we are so sorry." The room fell silent. Chloe stood there, unable to comprehend what was happening. What she had just witnessed, what she had done, now seemed like an irreparable mistake. Carter, the man so confident a moment ago, had suddenly paled, as if he had seen something he could not comprehend. Both of them, with all the power they thought they held, were now exposed. Leah said nothing, but her silence spoke louder than any words. She had made a move no one could have expected, and now, the truth was beginning to overturn everything. All eyes in the room were on Leah. She stood there, calm and silent, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had changed in just a few seconds. When the middle-aged woman apologized, an undercurrent began to rise, and the truth that no one had known until now was revealed. Leah Grant, this woman of color, was not just an ordinary passenger. She was the main investor in this airline corporation, the one behind the impending takeover. It was she, with her silence and unspoken power, who held the fate of this entire empire in her hands. No one present could understand the truth behind that simple name. Leah was not just a black woman standing in the business class. She was the owner of numbers, of big contracts that even their CEO had to bow to. But the earthquake, the truth, like a breaking wave, only started from this moment. The door to the emergency meeting room opened as soon as the executive's apology was announced. Employees began to stream in, and the entire crew was immediately called into an impromptu meeting. Right at the gate, it was tense and rushed. No one had time to ask or discuss what had just happened. Leah, alone, stood in the middle of the crowd. She didn't look angry. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked at Carter and Chloe, her eyes cold and disappointed. Disappointed, not because they were wrong, but because they didn't understand who they were standing before. Carter, the man who had always been confident in his power, was now like a child whose mistake had been pointed out. He stood there, unable to argue, unable to justify his actions. And then, another shock. Carter was suspended, while the other employees turned away as if they didn't want to be involved in this. Chloe, who had rejected Leah, could only stand there trembling, unable to stand firm under that cold gaze. What she had done now left only fear, regret, and nothing more. Leah stood there, silent. She didn't need to say another word. She didn't need to show anger or triumph. Because in this moment, Leah wasn't just demonstrating her power. She was teaching them a lesson about respect, about true power, about what really matters in life. And that earthquake, however small in its moment, would forever be etched in the memory of all who witnessed it. The atmosphere in the cabin suddenly changed. From a stifling silence, applause broke out, seemingly uncontrollable. The passengers who had witnessed shame and discrimination began to burst into excitement, not just because they had seen something unexpected, but because they had witnessed a rare moment of equality, where true power came not from privilege, but from respect for humanity. Their eyes were not only on Leah, they were on themselves, on the society where they had never dared to face this truth. And now, they were applauding not just for Leah, but for their own awakening. An old black man with traces of time on his face slowly walked up. His eyes were filled with emotion, and then he said the words he had never dared to say in his entire life. "I have waited for this moment all my life." Those words were like an oath, a thank you to Leah, who had not only won a small fight, but had opened the door for all those like him, those who had lived their whole lives in silence and patience, waiting for the justice that seemed to elude them. Then a white woman, her eyes filled with gratitude, took Leah's hand. "I'm sorry. We need people like you," she said, her voice full of sincerity. The words were not an apology for her own mistakes, but an admission, an opening. She not only felt remorse for what Leah had endured, but also realized that the world needed people like Leah. People willing to stand up, not just for themselves, but for all that was right. Leah in this moment did not rush to respond or try to change people's hearts. She just smiled, a smile not to retaliate, not to prove anything, but because the necessary thing had finally happened. They had to see what was happening before their eyes. She did not need to prove anything anymore, because the truth had spoken for itself. And that smile, cold but proud, was an affirmation that justice, however late, would eventually come. The whole space seemed to quiet down, where there was only the silence of understanding, something that had never been given to people like Leah before. Leah crossed the business class again, but this time no one dared to stop her. No one dared to judge or doubt. Eyes locked in a silent awe, as if everything had changed in an instant. Every person in the cabin, the passengers, the ones who had once looked at her with contempt or suspicion, now looked at her with a new awareness, a new understanding of what they had just witnessed. Leah was not just a woman who had been offended in that moment. She was a symbol of change, of true power that no one could have predicted. She walked through the rows, seemingly unchanged. The plush seats were still the same, the light still illuminating every delicate corner, but something had been revealed. She returned to her seat, seat 3A, the seat she had been denied earlier, the seat she had not been allowed to sit in when segregation had reigned. But this time, Leah did not feel like an outsider. There was no separation. There was no coldness of segregation. She sat in the seat, not just because it was her seat, but because she now had a power that no one could take away. The eyes of the passengers around her remained fixed on her, but not with scrutiny or aloofness. They looked at her with respect, with unspoken admiration. They realized that what Leah had just done was not a simple battle, but a fight for dignity and justice. She did not need to say anything more, did not need to prove anything more. With just one simple action, she had turned everything upside down. Power does not come from having money or position, but from being able to stand up and speak the truth, no matter what. Leah looked out the window. Nothing had changed in the landscape outside. The city was passing by, as life went on despite the passing of special moments. But everything inside her had changed forever. What she had just done was more than a personal victory. It was a reminder to all of us of what truly matters. Power is not something that can be bought or conquered, but rather held by those willing to stand up and demand respect. And in this business-class cabin, Leah Grant has become living proof of a very simple thing that many people have long failed to realize. True power lies in having the courage to look the truth in the eye and say that you are worthy. This isn't just a story about a woman who was humiliated and then sought revenge. It's a story about the calm in the middle of a storm, about being able to step into spaces where people think you don't belong, and then make them realize that they're the ones who are out of place. There are doors that don't need to be broken down, just walked through. Not because someone gave you power, but because you realize that true power is always in the hands of those who dare to stand up, demand respect, without any explanation. What would you do if you were Leah? Comment below. And if you believe that dignity shouldn't have to be proven, share this story, because everyone deserves to be in 3A, no explanation needed.